One of my joys as president is I get to share the history of the Sisters of St. Joseph and their founding in Le Puy. And I do it as often as I can because the story is really, it's so compelling and it actually calls us to something better than ourselves. These were remarkable women because they felt called to come together as a religious congregation, as a community of women who would be dedicated to doing social justice, following gospel values.
We know that the Sisters of St. Joseph lived in Le Puy and around that region in this time that was a post-war era. We know these women saw a lot of devastation, destitution, women and children living in poverty, especially if they had lost their fathers and husbands in the war. We know there was plague and pestilence, violence. Le Puy was a migrant city, so quite the crossroads of people coming through the city. So it was a very unstable time, and especially if you were a woman with children and didn't have a husband or father to protect you or to provide income, you could be living on the streets.
These 6 women came together and they had this idea that they would serve as women religious, as his congregation, but they would do it within the community of Le Puy. So rather than going behind cloister walls, which was the way women would go and live out their faith in a congregation of religious women, they decided they're going to stay in Le Puy, in the center, in the heart of the city, because they wanted to live among the people they would serve. For us, that doesn't seem so radical. In 1650 in France, that was unheard of. So they had to find a sponsor who actually would allow this, because at that time women couldn't just gather and organize on their own. There needed to be a priest who would shepherd the ministry. So they found a wonderful Jesuit, Jean-Pierre Médaille, who had progressive ideas of his own, and he allowed these women to do what they felt called to do.
Jean-Pierre Médaille was a Jesuit priest who was a traveling preacher, which was quite common in this post-Reformation time. And he began to meet these women and to hear of this desire that they had to serve the dear neighbor. And he felt called to help them. So he gathered these 6 women together, taught them spiritual practices rooted in his Ignatian Jesuit tradition, but also in this Salesian tradition of the School of French Spirituality. So that's where we have our Ignatian Salesian climate that formed those first 6 women. They could not read or write, so Jean-Pierre Médaille wrote 100 maxims for them, and also wrote the constitutions that ultimately became theirs when they became founded as a recognized community of sisters in 1650. So we think of Jean-Pierre Médaille as their partner, as their patron, as their ally, a man of the church who had the capacity to work with the bishop, Henri de Maupas, in Le Puy, and the 2 of them together found a way for the Sisters of St. Joseph to be founded as a recognized religious community out of the cloister in 1650.
So this young Jesuit, Jean-Pierre Médaille, the women talked to him about being a religious community. And he said, well, you know, you have to live in an enclosure. Well, no, they weren't about to live in any enclosure. So he goes to the bishop and he says, I have this problem. I have these women that want to be a religious community, but are not willing to live in an enclosure. So the bishop says, well, we'll just have to pray and get inspired by the Holy Spirit. So some months later, he calls Jean-Pierre and says, I have an idea. I will write to Rome, and I will say, I'm willing to be the patron of this new community. I have a hospital. I could convert a wing into a cloister. Well, nobody ever lived in the hospital. They just kept on doing what they were doing before.
And that was enormously important, because then they served in a whole new way. What I loved also about the sisters and these founding women is they had this other vision about how you serve. Rather than assuming they knew what the needs of the people were, which is what many of us do, they had this revolutionary idea that you actually would ask the people what they needed. And so they divided the city in parts, and they went out and asked the people, what do you need? What can we do to help you? What can we do to better your lives? What they discovered was the most vulnerable group of people in Le Puy at the time were single women. There were women who were unmarried, there were widows, there had been plagues, there had been wars. It was a very hard time in France. And so these women who did not have the protection of a male were often forced or compelled finally to go into lives of prostitution as a means of survival. And they were exploited terribly. And so the sisters decided that they would teach them to make lace.
Two of our sisters knew how to make lace, and cotton lace was in great demand in Le Puy at that time. Upper-class society used the lace in their homes and on their clothing.
The women, through this educational experience, would be able to create for themselves a life of meaning and a life of independence. And you know, for me, I look at that story and I think all these years later, in Los Angeles, California, in the 21st century, we're doing the same thing. We're empowering women through this incredible educational experience. We're changing their lives. We're giving them the means to create a life of meaning, a life of independence, a life of purpose. But it's always grounded in how do you serve others, as the First Sisters did, and of course, as the CSJs have done across their history.
We know that one of those sisters ran a hospital, and in that hospital was a large stone kitchen. And at night, she would have the other sisters over after they had done their service to the community, and they would share their day. And this is where we get this spiritual practice that the sisters do to this day called the sharing of the heart. And so they would gather around the fireplace in the kitchen, and they would share what their experience was like, what it was like to meet the people on the streets and to try to serve the dear neighbor.
When I went into the kitchen where the original 6 sisters would gather in the evening, and I had heard of this space, and I had seen pictures of this space, so I thought I knew exactly what I was walking into. And I was absolutely blown away by it and taken by surprise, because when I walked in and saw this space that has not been kept up in any meaningful way, it's just the space it was, with this enormous fireplace. It's a very kind of earthy looking room.
It's a privilege to stand in the kitchen. You step down into this cool, somewhat damp, dark place, but you really feel the power of the stones that make up that room, and it's very easy to imagine a fire going in the hearth and women sitting in a circle. So you feel like you're standing in history.
It just took over, that this is where these women in 1650, in a very hard time in France's history, a very rough time to live, that they gathered here to talk about how they would serve the people of Le Puy. That was so moving, and it was a sense that as those sisters gathered, here we were, a group of pilgrims who were coming and trying to think about how will we serve in the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph as we go forward. It was incredibly moving and humbling.
It's a privilege, and it feels historic. It feels strengthening in many ways. It's an invitation for us to connect and to be a part of this legacy.